Hey, what's up, guys? Stoning is one of the most misunderstood topics in the Bible. Most people probably assume that when someone did something wrong, people would bend down, pick up the closest rock, and just start going to town on that person until they were dead. That couldn't be farther from the truth, though. The truth is, there were rules that had to be followed in regards to hearing cases, passing judgment, and carrying out penalties, including stoning someone to death. And we'll get into that later, but first I want to touch on a few verses that show that stoning was actually commanded by Yahweh and not just a barbaric practice. So let's take a look at Exodus 19:12 and 13. Put boundaries for the people all around the mountain, and say, be careful that you don't go up on the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain will be put to death. No hand may touch him. Instead, he will be stoned or shot with arrows. No animal or man will live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up the mountain. Now let's jump over to Leviticus 20 and verse 2. Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the country are to stone him. And finally, let's take a look at Leviticus 24:14 and through 16. Bring the one who has cursed to the outside of the camp, and have all who heard him lay their hands on his head. Then have the whole community stone him. And tell the Israelites, if anyone curses his God, he will bear the consequences of his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of Yahweh is to be put to death. The whole community must stone him. If he blasphemes the name, he is to be put to death, whether the foreigner residing or the native. In each one of the verses we just read, we can see that it was Yahweh that was commanding the stoning. And it was also Yahweh who created capital punishment, not man. God instituted capital punishment as a legitimate punitive option for every state. Its institution predates Israel's birth as a nation and Moses' divinely inspired directions for its governance, eliminating the possibility that it was mandated solely for Israel. God issued guidance on capital punishment to Earth's only surviving people in Genesis 7:20 through 24, and God instructed them to provide the foundation for all subsequent governments. As far as stoning goes, there were only certain crimes or sins that warranted stoning someone to death. Here's a list of all the sins that were punishable by death. Intentional homicide, false witnessing in a capital case, idolatry, including human and animal sacrifices, blasphemy, witchcraft and false claims to prophecy, profaning the Sabbath, rape, adultery, sexual relations outside of marriage. That was before marriage, where the woman alone would be executed. That was consensual relations with another's betrothed, where both the man and the woman were executed. And there were laws about a priest's daughter having premarital sexual relations, in which she would be stoned. Acts of incest, homosexuality, and bestiality, kidnapping, cursing or striking one's parents, incorrigibility, which means someone who refuses to be corrected, and refusing to obey the court. If a person was found guilty of any of the above sins, then they were to be put to death, and stoning was the most often used method to do that. Like I said earlier, though, people couldn't just bend down and pick up a rock whenever they felt like somebody was doing something wrong and throw it at them. There was a court system in place, and there were rules that had to be followed. Number 1, the accused person must have committed a crime for which death is an appropriate punishment. God states life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot in Deuteronomy 19:21. Number 2, clear evidence of guilt must be provided by 2 or more witnesses. One witness was not sufficient to warrant capital punishment. Aware that unscrupulous people may use the death penalty for evil purposes, God requires multiple witnesses to the crime. Number 3, those charged with crimes must be treated in a uniform and impartial manner, regardless of the status or class of the offender. Any society that favors some people and discriminates against others because of class or status, or deprives some of adequate defense, intentionally or through neglect, diminishes its integrity and creates serious doubts about its administration of justice. So on top of these 3 things, the witnesses who testified had to be the first people to cast the stones. And if the guilty person was still alive after that, then, and only then, were other people who were around able to pick up stones and also throw them at the guilty person until they were dead. And we can see this in Deuteronomy 17:7. The witness's hands are to be the first in putting him to death, and after that, the hands of all the people. You must purge evil from you. So, there were rules concerning bearing false witness in a case as well. If a malicious witness testifies against someone accusing him of a crime, the 2 people in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priest and judges in authority at that time. The judges are to make a careful investigation, and if the witness turns out to be a liar who has falsely accused his brother, you must do to him as he intended to do to his brother. You must purge the evil from you. After looking at all this information, we can start to put together a better picture of what stoning was really all about in the ancient Near East. But here's one last piece of information. If a case is too difficult for you concerning bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, cases disputed at your gates, you must go up to the place the Lord your God chooses. You are to go to the Levitical priest and to the judge who presides at that time. Ask, and they will give you a verdict in the case. You must abide by the verdict they give you at the place the Lord chooses. Be careful to do exactly as they instruct you. You must abide by the instruction they give you and the verdict they announce to you. Do not turn to the right or to the left from the decision they declare to you. Now we should be able to see that stoning wasn't a case of random people picking up rocks and just throwing them at someone until they killed them because they did something wrong. There were rules in place that had to be followed, such as there had to be no less than 2 witnesses. There had to be a trial held for those 2 witnesses to be able to testify. No partiality could be shown to either the accuser or the accused, and it didn't matter if you were a foreigner in the land or if you were a native born of the land. If you gave false testimony, then you were also, if you gave false testimony and they found out you were lying, then you were punished the same punishment that the person that you gave your false testimony against would have been. And since we're talking about capital punishment here, then that would have been death. So if someone was on trial and you were claiming to be a witness and you said, yeah, I saw Joe, he was committing adultery, and come to find out you just didn't like Joe and he really wasn't committing adultery, then you would be stoned for lying in that case and bearing false testimony against Joe. So if someone was found guilty, then, the 2 witnesses, they had to be the first 2 people to throw stones. So that was another, if you gave false testimony and someone was sentenced to be stoned to death, you basically were killing a person. I mean, you were murdering that person because you had to be the first person to throw the stones at them and start the process of stoning them. So we can start to see that the idea that many people have about what stoning was like back in the ancient Near East is really not correct at all. And that's why people like to ask people like us who follow Torah, when they find out we follow Torah, one of the questions they'll ask is, well, do you stone your kids? We can't stone our kids. We're not under a biblical government, so we can't stone anybody. We don't have Levitical priests. We don't have, all the rules that go along with stoning are not being followed today. So if we were to take our kids out in the backyard and stone them, we actually would be breaking Torah by doing that. And that's the same situation that Yeshua was dealing with in the story of the adulterous woman. Some people like to, believe that story was an example of Yeshua coming in and bringing grace and, making things all about love and, saying that the old law no longer applies. But is that really the case? Well, we're going to read that story and we're going to break down and see exactly what it's really saying. So if you want to follow along, turn in your Bibles to John 8, starting in verse 2. At dawn he went down to the temple complex again, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. Teacher, they said, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? They asked this to trap him, in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. Yeshua stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, the one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the woman in the center. When Yeshua stood up, he said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, Lord, she answered. Neither do I condemn you, said Yeshua. Go, and from now on, do not sin any more. Unless we understand the Torah and the instructions concerning adultery and stoning, it does seem like Yeshua is replacing the Torah with a more loving way. But there's a major clue in this story, and that is going to show us exactly what is actually going on here. In verse 6, it says, they asked this to trap him in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. So we can see they were trying to trap him. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in order to have a full picture, we have to go back to the Torah and see exactly what the instructions were for stoning someone for committing adultery. If a man commits adultery with a married woman, if he commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Leviticus 20:10. If a man is discovered having sexual relations with another man's wife, both that man who had sex with the woman and the woman must die. You must purge evil from Israel. Deuteronomy 22:22. So we can see that both the man and the woman have to be put to death. And based on everything that we've covered about stoning and trials and witnesses and the processes that had to take place before someone could be stoned, we see that that woman was there by herself. There was no man present. So hopefully that makes things a little more clear, and we can see how they were trying to trap Yeshua. Where was the man at? Where were the two witnesses at? Why was this taking place right here in the middle of who knows where, and not taking place at the city gates or being heard by the Levitical priest or by the judges of the time? These people just walked right up to Yeshua in the middle of where he was standing and said, hey, we need to stone this woman. If he would have done that, he actually would have been breaking Torah. Even if he would have given them the okay to stone her, he still would have been breaking Torah, because the protocols that were in place to make sure that, the rules were being followed weren't being followed. They were trying to trap Yeshua. He didn't fall for it though, like all the other times when they tried to trap him. What he ended up doing was turning it around on them, and they realized he did this, and we can see this in verse 17, when he tells them, "The one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her." Well, after he said that, they all left, starting with the oldest, and then the younger guys. The older guys knew what was going on. They knew exactly what Yeshua had done. And that's why the older men left first, and then the younger men were like, hey, the old men left. Maybe they know something, we probably shouldn't mess with this situation. Let's just follow their lead, and we'll leave too. So that left Yeshua with the woman all by himself, and he told her, "Go and sin no more." So he wasn't, this wasn't a situation of him doing something new and getting rid of the old law and trying to say, it's all about love and grace now. He was actually upholding the Torah by not stoning this adulterous woman. And he told her, "Go and sin no more." So, chances are she was guilty, and Yeshua knew that. But if he would have stoned her without the man being present, without a trial taking place and the witnesses testifying, he would have been breaking Torah and not upholding Torah. So here's something to think about. If Yeshua broke the Torah, if he sinned, then that disqualifies him from being the spotless lamb, and his death means nothing. Just something to keep in mind there. Anytime someone tries to tell you that he was not upholding the Torah, or that he, did away with it, or that, he didn't do this or that. If Yeshua sinned, and we know that sin is the transgression of the law, then that disqualifies him as the Messiah. Anyway, we hope this teaching has been a blessing to you. And remember, stay thirsty for the pure milk of the Word.